Are you still under the illusion that everything is fine and dandy while the world crumbles right in front of your eyes? The crisis we're living through right now in 2025 isn't just about the natural disasters we've seen intensify, nor is it merely the continuation of the health crisis that shook us to our core a few years back. There's a deep and deliberate plan unfolding, a plan that aims to reshape the global system in such a way that a few at the top pull all the strings, while everyone else scrambles for survival in a tightly controlled environment. It's all happening faster than we ever anticipated, and we're now seeing the unmistakable signs that what started as a possible scenario in 2022 is now striking in full force. Things are going beyond shortages of food, water, lumber, plastic, or microchips. What we're looking at is a fundamental disruption of day-to-day life. It's carefully engineered, not some spontaneous ripple caused by random occurrences. Many people still refuse to see it, preferring to cling to the illusion of business as usual. But the moment they realize something's very wrong, it'll likely be too late for them to do anything. Maybe they're your friends, your neighbors, or your family. But if you don't want to share their fate, you need to keep watching and pay close attention until the end. It could make the difference between struggling and thriving. The reality is this: every global power is maneuvering to secure resources, especially energy, and they're fully aware that control over these resources is the deciding factor in who calls the shots in the coming decade. We saw the beginnings of this scenario back in 2022, but right now in 2025, it's in a whole new phase of escalation. Plenty of people talk about the new normal, yet few truly grasp how sinister it can be once you peel away the glossy packaging. Let's break it down. Look at Central Asia, a region that has become a major flashpoint in the ongoing energy chess game. 3 years ago, we discussed Russia's deepening influence in Kazakhstan, and now it's practically an open secret that Russia and China have thoroughly consolidated their hold on that corridor. Kazakhstan has vast reserves of coal, gas, oil, and uranium. With global energy prices skyrocketing and new technologies needing a steady flow of certain critical minerals, Kazakhstan's significance has quadrupled. The story that began with economic partnerships and mutual defense pacts has evolved into heavily militarized borderlands and tightly controlled pipelines, with local populations feeling the pinch. Dissatisfaction is still prevalent. Every new price hike and every new restriction sparks local protests. They may not make the headlines in the West, but they're out there, boiling like a pressure cooker. We also mentioned Turkmenistan back in 2022. Since then, we've seen new measures that have effectively cut off millions from subsidized food. As of January 2025, official reports indicate inflation in Turkmenistan is hovering at an alarming 38%, and that's just the official number. Unofficially, it's believed to be much higher. Everyday staples, flour, sugar, rice, are increasingly out of reach. The government is so focused on funneling its natural gas towards its largest buyer, China, that it leaves its own people to scramble for scraps. These Central Asian nations are now the epicenter of a crisis that started with rising energy costs but quickly spiraled into widespread hunger and desperation. You may think that this situation is confined to remote corners of the globe, but think again. In the West, the tension is just as palpable. At the beginning of the year, the United Kingdom entered a new phase of turbulence. Inflation, which was already high, turned critical. The official inflation rate soared above 18% last quarter, marking the highest in several decades. In real life, many Britons are spending double on basic groceries compared to the same time last year. That's right, double. And guess what that translates into? More crime, more street fights, and more tension in communities that were already struggling. You might have caught some headlines or maybe a few amateur videos on social media showing scuffles in front of grocery stores over the last bag of apples or the last liter of milk. It's easy to ignore these until they happen on your street. Across the pond, the United States is hardly an exception. Ever since the wave of bank collapses in late 2023, triggered by surging food and energy costs, the domino effect has led to record-high credit card debt, mortgage crises, and now even the mainstream media is discussing the possibility of controlled rationing of certain commodities in major metropolitan areas. Talk to people in small towns in the Midwest. They've been complaining about drastically reduced choices in supermarket aisles for months, with entire sections empty, not because the items don't exist somewhere, but because the supply chain can't or won't get them there in time. Let's not even mention the folks who lost their homes to fires or storms. They're effectively on their own. Australia, usually considered a stable economy with strong connections to Asian markets, is feeling the crunch just like everyone else. Since mid-2024, when massive floods swept through some of the nation's key agricultural regions, the cost of fresh produce has skyrocketed 45%. Thousands of acres of farmland were left unusable, not just because of the floods, but also the subsequent influx of pests that devastated what was left. I keep getting messages from Australian viewers saying their stores regularly run out of fresh fruits and vegetables, forcing them to settle for canned or frozen goods. With inflation, they're approaching 12%, a number that was unimaginable just 3 or 4 years ago. The lucky country doesn't feel quite as lucky anymore. Now, some of you might ask, why is this all happening at once? Is it just the result of climate change, unfortunate weather events, or random geopolitical tensions? I've been saying for years that food shortages are often engineered or at the very least exaggerated by those in power to gain advantage. They test these methods in far-flung countries that few pay attention to, refining their strategies before rolling them out globally. How do you raise commodity prices? You create or exploit conditions that drive up energy costs, like shutting down pipelines or restricting exports. You also let farmland degrade through overuse, questionable land grabs, or by systematically removing farmers from the land. Look at how big corporations buy up farmland at bargain prices. Next, you facilitate conflicts that disrupt supply lines. There's always a conflict somewhere that coincidentally affects the transport of essential goods. Then you create local or regional emergencies, diseases that force mass culling of livestock, extreme weather that leads to poor harvests, or even mysterious factory accidents that hamper production. In the end, you have a perfect storm of scarcity. What happens next is predictable. Prices shoot up, the middle class finds it increasingly difficult to feed their families, and soon enough you have unrest. Historically, even the mildest shortages can cause panic, leading to hoarding, looting, and violence. Hungry people have no loyalty to the system. If you don't believe me, see how quickly a so-called civil society can unravel when basic necessities are missing. I've shown you examples of small-scale chaos in previous videos, and I'll remind you now, in any major crisis, we can't just assume law enforcement will calmly handle the situation. The men and women in uniform have their own families to worry about. In Kazakhstan in January 2022, we saw the police stepping aside or even joining the protesters. That was just a prelude to the kind of breakdown we can see when push comes to shove and hunger knocks on the door. Over the last 3 years, I've emphasized the plan to reduce the population. Some call it a conspiracy, others see the logic behind it. Remember that the United Nations still projects the global population to exceed 10 billion by 2050. From a purely resource allocation perspective, food, water, energy, many in power see this as a recipe for disaster. We've repeatedly heard about sustainability goals, but if you read between the lines, certain powerful entities are essentially admitting that there won't be enough to go around. In their eyes, controlling the population is the only way to maintain their grip on a global system that allows them to live in unimaginable comfort while the masses fight for scraps. Look at China's actions over the past few years. As I told you in my videos in 2022 and 2023, China was aggressively stockpiling grains, wheat, corn, and soy beyond their immediate consumption needs. They also strongly encouraged their citizens to keep reserves of essential staples as early as winter 2021. Now, at the start of 2025, we're seeing those stockpiles come into play, with China able to buffer the impact of failing harvests in parts of the country. They're also leveraging these reserves in international trade deals, using them as bargaining chips to secure other resources. It's a form of power that most people overlook. Food can be as potent as an army when it comes to global influence. Recent pandemics among livestock have only worsened the global picture, particularly for chicken and egg production. Outbreaks in 2024 decimated poultry farms in Eastern Europe and parts of South America, pushing egg prices to triple in those regions. Remember when we used to take eggs for granted as one of the most affordable sources of protein? Now entire families have had to cut back drastically, leaving them with few alternatives. It's not just about rising prices, it's about the psychological impact of losing daily stability. These small but essential items that vanish from dinner tables send shock waves through communities. Many point to severe weather events as the tipping point for poor harvests, but consider how suspiciously frequent these are in regions that supply the bulk of our staples, like Southeast Asia or the American Midwest. Forest fires, drought, and unexpected freezing conditions. Do you really believe all of these are naturally occurring at the scale we've seen? Maybe some of them are, but when they strike in suspiciously coordinated patterns, it's worth questioning if there's more at play. Even if you believe they're entirely natural, the fact remains that the crisis is here and we need to prepare. Speaking of disruptions, remember I mentioned solar storms in one of my early videos about cosmic threats? In late 2024, we witnessed a moderate solar event that knocked out communication satellites over parts of the Pacific for a few hours. It was a grim reminder of how fragile our technology-dependent system is. A stronger geomagnetic storm, one that could, in theory, take down entire electric grids, would absolutely devastate supply chains and communication networks. Do you have a plan for that scenario? Candles won't suffice when your fridge is out and your credit card doesn't work because the electronic network is down. I'm here to remind you once again to stock up on basics. Food, water, medical supplies. Do this before the next wave of crises hits, because by the time the mainstream media starts flashing headlines that society can't ignore, every panicked buyer in your town will rush to clear out the stores. In 2022, many people told me I was exaggerating or fear-mongering. Look at them now. Some of those same people are emailing me, asking for help or tips because they can't find certain key items in stores or can't afford them even if they do find them. Don't let yourself be in that position. Think about your grandparents or great-grandparents. It was common sense to store enough supplies to last for months. They knew the unpredictability of life and how easily a bad harvest, a war, or a pandemic could strike. Ironically, in our age of high technology, global supply routes, and instant communication, we've lost that survival instinct. Of course, some still label these preparations as paranoid. That's exactly how the system wants you to think. They rely on ignorance to keep you docile. If you're convinced that everything is available 24/7 at the click of a button or a short drive to the store, you become lazy in your readiness. That's precisely the vulnerability that can, and likely will, be exploited if it hasn't been already. And let me tell you another sobering truth. There is no guarantee your government or your local authorities will take care of you in a real crisis. We've seen them drop the ball multiple times in the past few years, from inadequate responses to pandemics to failing to provide basic shelter and resources during storms, droughts, or blackouts. Remember that in a crisis, everyone is scrambling to save themselves and their close circles. The bureaucracy is slow and often incompetent, especially when the crisis is multifaceted: energy, food, water, finance, and so on. You don't want to be at the mercy of a system that's historically proven it can barely manage small-scale emergencies, let alone a global meltdown. The next question is always, what's the end game? Well, it's not hard to guess. Once people reach the point of desperation, when they can't feed themselves or their children, or they're freezing in the dark, they'll accept drastic solutions. That could include a complete overhaul of currency systems, forced migration to designated areas, or digital identification programs that tie directly to your ability to purchase necessities. Any form of dissent or protest is far easier to suppress when you can switch off a person's ability to buy a loaf of bread with a keystroke. If this sounds dystopian, consider that many governments have already been testing the waters with digital currencies and advanced surveillance tech. All they need is a big enough crisis to roll it out under the banner of public safety or emergency measures. Despite everything, I remain convinced that individuals still have the power to protect themselves and their families if they act now. I've been forced to move my content multiple times when certain platforms decided my message was too controversial or stepped out of line with their community guidelines. That's why I'm grateful for the community that has supported me on alternative platforms and through direct means like Patreon. Censorship is another piece of the puzzle. When crises worsen, one of the first things those in power do is choke off independent voices. If you find value in what I share, keep an eye out for my updates wherever I am, because my videos and posts might not always stay on the same platforms. I'll close by reiterating that each of us can control our own preparedness. Don't be caught in the trap of thinking you'll magically be spared. We're living in a time where the next shortage, the next disaster, or the next major conflict can trigger a chain reaction. The lines between engineered and natural crises have blurred more than ever. You need to be vigilant. You need to have supplies. You need to have a plan. And you need to have a clear mindset, not clouded by the constant narrative that everything's going to be fine. It's much better to be prepared and not need those preparations than to be unprepared and face an emergency head-on. Thank you for sticking with me through this video. I know it's longer and more aggressive than usual, but the time for sugarcoating is over. We're in 2025 and the writing is on the wall. If you appreciate the work I do to keep you informed, share this with those who might still be on the fence. Hopefully, they'll wake up before it's too late. And if you want to support this channel, you know where to find me. Together, we can maintain a community that sees through the lies and prepares accordingly. Stay safe, stay informed, and always keep your eyes on the real threats out there. God bless each and every one of you.